She gave up her crown for love, then found out he was already taken. Her brother, Henry VIII, helped her escape, but only to trap her later in a different kind of betrayal. This is the story of Margaret Tudor, the sister history forgot, and the woman who outplayed the most dangerous king in England. So ask yourself, if blood is thicker than water, why did theirs turn to poison? Imagine being born not for who you are, but for what your marriage could secure. That was Margaret Tudor's fate, and she entered the world in 1489 as the first Tudor princess, daughter to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And while her birth brought joy to the court, it wasn't exactly sentimental. Henry VII had just seized the throne by killing Richard III, and his crown still trembled on his head. He couldn't lean on divine right or noble lineage. Instead, he needed alliances, strong ones. And what better diplomat currency than royal daughters? From the moment she could walk, Margaret wasn't nurtured for selfhood, she was groomed for strategy. She was raised in the grandeur of Eltham Palace, surrounded by polished courtiers, political whispers, and her infamous siblings, the future Henry VIII, the future heartbreaker of England, and Mary, who'd one day charm the French court. Royals loved marrying off literal children, and Margaret Tudor's family followed that grim tradition to the letter. At just 6 years old, she was promised to the 22-year-old King James IV of Scotland, not out of love, but to cement the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. For the English court, she was a diplomatic tool. For Margaret, it meant a future written before she even knew how to read it. What does perpetual peace mean to a girl of 12 married by proxy to a man she barely knew? Councillors fretted that the marriage could open the door for Scottish claims to England's crown, but that wasn't Margaret's concern. Her world turned upside down in 1503. She lost her newborn sibling, then her mother, Queen Elizabeth of York, all in 1 week. Grief had barely taken hold before her father ordered her north. 1 week she was mourning. The next, she was Queen of Scots, carried off to Edinburgh like a chess piece in her father's political game. The real wedding followed on August 8th, but the emotional ceremony had already happened, the one where Margaret said goodbye to childhood. And as she stepped into her new role, did she believe she was forging peace or walking into a gilded prison? Margaret Tudor's marriage to King James IV had all the makings of a fairy tale on the surface. Sure, he was far too old for her by modern standards, but in the world of royal politics, James was a catch. Handsome, cultured, and beloved by his people. During their wedding at the picturesque Holyrood Abbey, he charmed the crowd by leaping onto his horse without using the stirrups, then lifting Margaret up to ride with him through the cheering streets of Edinburgh. For a brief moment it seemed Margaret might escape the cold fate so many royal women endured. But reality came fast and cruel. Margaret would endure 6 agonizing pregnancies with only one child, a son named James, surviving infancy. The joy of motherhood was constantly shadowed by loss. And as Margaret grieved her babies, the world around her grew darker. When her father, Henry VII, died in 1509, her younger brother Henry took the English throne, and with it any illusion of lasting peace. Henry VIII's aggressive pursuit of war with France shattered diplomatic ties, dragging Scotland into the crossfire. James, bound by Scotland's alliance with France, prepared for battle against England. Margaret, caught between 2 kings, her brother and her husband, could do nothing to stop what was coming. What's more tragic than standing between 2 powerful men who both claim to love you, yet are ready to destroy each other? In the weeks leading up to the Battle of Flodden, Margaret was tormented by visions, nightmares of James falling from a great height. On September 9th, 1513, she sat alone in Linlithgow Palace, knowing in her bones what no one had yet confirmed. James had led his army into a brutal, uneven battle. 10,000 Scots perished. Beloved James charged into the fray, only to be violently slain by the English forces. But what came next was even colder. Margaret's sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, yes, the same Catherine married to Henry VIII, had James's blood-soaked coat sent to her husband as a token of victory, a trophy, a gift. What kind of person does that? To Margaret, it was a symbol of betrayal. By her brother, by her role as queen, by a world that had promised peace and delivered carnage. How do you mourn a husband whose death was celebrated by your own family? With her husband dead on the battlefield and her toddler son now King of Scotland, Margaret Tudor, barely 24 years old, stepped into a role few dared imagine for a woman, regent of a kingdom in mourning. Technically, she had every right to rule. James IV's will named her as regent until young Prince James came of age. But the ink hadn't even dried before the Scottish lords began plotting around her. To them, she was a double threat, not just a woman, but the sister of the man who had killed their king. Misogyny ran deep, but national hatred ran deeper. Instead of rallying behind her, the court questioned her loyalty, her competence, even her very presence. And all the while, Margaret was pregnant, grieving, exhausted, and clinging to authority as nobles circled like wolves. That spring she gave birth to Alexander, James IV's final child. In August 1514, just a year after losing her husband at Flodden, Margaret Tudor stunned Scotland by eloping with Archibald Douglas, a man young, charming, and frankly, a witless fool. History doesn't shy away from calling it scandalous, but who among us hasn't sacrificed too much for love and paid for it in heartbreak? By marrying Douglas, Margaret didn't just defy the court's wishes, she forfeited her crown. The will of the late James IV had granted her regency only while she remained a widow. That clause, overlooked in romance, became her political undoing. To make matters worse, Archibald had lied. He was already engaged, some accounts say even married, to another woman. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation on an international stage. The Scottish lords, furious, demanded Margaret surrender both her crown and her sons, Prince James and infant Alexander, into their care. She agreed, not out of trust, but out of desperation. Margaret turned to an unlikely ally, her brother King Henry VIII. He arranged her escape from Scotland, though not out of brotherly love. Margaret was still his heir at the time, and he needed her alive. He did not, however, provide comfort. Pregnant by her second husband and gravely ill, Margaret gave birth to a daughter alone in exile, and the blows kept coming. Word reached her that Alexander, her youngest, had died before reaching his second birthday. Crushed by grief, Margaret lashed out the only way she could. She publicly accused the Duke of Albany of poisoning her child. Was it grief, madness, or was there truth behind the claim? If you were in her shoes, watching your children taken, your power stripped, your body broken, and your husband nowhere in sight, would you have blamed someone too? Or was the real poison not in the bottle, but in the power games that surrounded her? By 1517, Margaret was back in Scotland, older, wiser, and about to have her world flipped yet again. Her second husband, Archibald Douglas, had cozied up with his old mistress and was happily funding their extravagant lifestyle hand with Margaret's money. Infidelity is painful in any century, but imagine being humiliated on a national stage by a man who also held your purse strings, locked you out of your lands, and blocked you from your son's court. Divorce in the 1500s wasn't just a personal ordeal, it was political warfare. Douglas had power, titles, and allies. Margaret had, well, an enemy. But in royal politics, your worst enemy today can be your best hope tomorrow. The Duke of Albany, once a fierce rival, had been ousted by Douglas's camp. Margaret saw an opportunity and did what few queens could. She forged an alliance that flipped the game. In November 1521, she and Albany pulled off a royal coup. Douglas was stripped of his authority, his influence shattered, and in one of the most poetic scenes in Tudor Scottish history, Margaret marched into Edinburgh not beside a king or a husband, but beside the man who once tried to destroy her. It wasn't just revenge, it was survival, strategy, and a masterclass in reclaiming power. How far would you go to undo betrayal? And what does it say about power when a queen must side with her old nemesis just to be heard? Rumours swirled that the Queen of Scots was having an affair with her new ally. But she was dealing with far more than just an unpopular romance. Margaret Tudor thought she'd seen every kind of betrayal, but nothing cuts deeper than being deceived by someone you call a friend. The woman was Isabella Hopringle, a nun no less, whom Margaret trusted deeply. But beneath the veil and pious smile was a double agent, funneling secrets straight to Henry VIII. Every time England and Scotland teetered toward war, Isabella passed along whispers from Margaret's household, and when the Scots finally caught wind of it, they were ready to punish not just Isabella, but her entire convent. In a twist only Tudor politics could produce, Margaret, still loyal, still hopeful, intervened to save her friend. She gave Isabella a second chance, and Isabella thanked her by continuing to spy. As Isabella's double-dealing had already revealed, the old hatred between Scotland and England was roaring back to life. For years they clashed, came terrifyingly close to war, then backed away only after frantic noblemen fired off enough desperate diplomatic letters. Treachery was everywhere, every side schemed, until the chaos finally calmed, and in 1524, Margaret's son, King James V, officially claimed his throne. But a crown on her son's head didn't mean peace for Margaret. Her fiercest battle was still personal, her estranged, ruthless husband, Archibald Douglas. Though Henry VIII pushed for their reunion, Margaret was laser-focused on ending it all. She had stripped Douglas of power, sent him packing to 2 foreign lands, and had even waived the threat of war before letting him crawl back into Scotland. There was no doubt. She was done with him. But Henry refused to accept her no. Instead, he summoned Douglas and urged him to reclaim his sister's heart. When Margaret firmly rejected the idea, Douglas struck back with fury. With his allies, he stormed into Scottish Parliament, aiming to snatch authority from both Margaret and the boy king. In a bold move, Margaret reached out to her former rival, the Duke of Albany, swearing she'd fight England at his side before ever letting Douglas near her again. That letter fatefully ended up with the worst person imaginable, her brother, Henry VIII. His furious response shattered her resolve. Terrified, she reversed course and made nice with Douglas. And the moment Douglas got a sliver of power, he bled it dry. Case in point. In 1526, he was handed control over 14-year-old King James, and he used it to try turning the boy against both Margaret and King Henry. He practically held James hostage, refusing to return him to his mother's side. Margaret tried everything to bring her son home, but each attempt failed. In the end, after 3 brutal years in the house of his deranged stepfather, the young king had to break free completely on his own. When James finally saw his mother again, he barely recognized the woman she'd become. Margaret now had a new companion, Henry Stuart, a nobleman whose sudden rise to prominence had raised more than a few eyebrows. By 1524, she was granting him courtly titles and royal privileges, stirring resentment among the powerful lords of Scotland. Soon, the pair began living together, and whispers spread like wildfire. Was Margaret hiding a pregnancy outside of marriage? The Queen, once ever present in matters of state, had nearly vanished from Parliament. Her urgency for divorce grew impossible to ignore. And this time, she had a winning card. Archibald Douglas, her estranged husband, had been engaged, possibly even married to another woman when he wed her. That revelation gave Margaret the ground she needed. At last, she was legally free. But rather than enjoy her independence, she rushed into marriage again, this time with Lord Methven. Tragically, history repeated itself. Methven turned out to be just as unfaithful and extravagant as Douglas, keeping a mistress and squandering Margaret's funds. A decade into this new union, Margaret found herself right back where she started, seeking yet another divorce. Was she chasing freedom, or simply trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape? After June 1528, James V stepped fully into power, and Margaret found herself pushed to the sidelines of Scottish politics. The mother who had once ruled as regent now held no place in her son's court. No influence, no official role. Their relationship had soured beyond repair. James refused her requests, including her pleas for another divorce, which only deepened the rift. Margaret voiced her frustrations, accusing the king of withholding funds and treating her unfairly. But behind the scenes, there was a deeper betrayal. Margaret had secretly shared sensitive political information with her brother, James's rival, Henry VIII. That breach of trust shattered what little remained of their bond. In the end, it wasn't court politics or foreign enemies that ended Margaret's influence, it was family, and the silence that followed was the cruelest punishment of all. By 1543, Margaret Tudor's world had narrowed to petitions and silence. She spent her final years desperately writing to Henry VIII, begging him to send back her daughter, Lady Margaret Douglas, who had followed so closely in her mother's scandalous footsteps. Raised in the English court, the younger Margaret sparked her own crisis by falling for a courtier and landing herself in the Tower of London. Though eventually freed, she never returned to Scotland and never saw her mother again. In truth, Margaret Tudor had long ceased to be a trusted mother, a wise ruler, or even a welcomed presence. Her sharp tongue and relentless ambition had alienated her brother, her son, and nearly every powerful ally she once held. Even after she and James V reconciled, their shared moments were fleeting and strained. Not long after a stroke, Margaret passed away on October 18, 1541, at the age of 51. She had called for James, but he didn't arrive in time. Her final breath came in solitude. And yet, despite everything, her legacy endured. Some say she planted the seed that would grow into Henry's obsession with divorce. Even Henry, appalled by her boldness, once muttered that no one could live a more shameful life than Margaret. But history, complicated as it is, rarely forgets those who dared to defy its rules. After all the betrayals, scandals, and heartbreaks, it wasn't Henry VIII who secured the future of the British crown. It was Margaret. While he left behind a fractured legacy and no legitimate grandchildren, she became the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the great-grandmother of James I. It was James who ultimately inherited the English throne, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England. So in the end, history crowned not the king who reigned with fear, but the sister who survived him. The British royal family today traces its lineage not through Henry's troubled line, but through the so-called scandalous Margaret Tudor, the woman who, quietly and defiantly, had the last laugh. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold history.